I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
There are precisely 3 things in this world that Nero Wolfe will not tolerate: a tough piece of meat, a draft on his neck, and an uninvited presence in his office. On a crisp, exceptionally clear Tuesday morning in late April, we were subjected to the third. It was 10:54 a.m. I had just returned from a highly stimulating trip to the bank to deposit a check from a satisfied shipping magnate, and I was looking forward to Wolfe's descent from the plant rooms on the roof. The schedule is sacred. From 9 to 11, he tended the orchids with Theodore Horstman. At 11 sharp, the elevator groans, and a seventh of a ton of genius settles behind the custom-made desk in the office to drink beer, read, and occasionally complain about my typing. I hung my hat in the hall, nodded to Fritz, who was in the kitchen aggressively whisking something that smelled of tarragon, and stepped into the office. I stopped. My hand instinctively drifted toward the left armpit of my tailored jacket, though I hadn't worn the shoulder holster to the bank. There was a man sitting in the red leather chair. He hadn't rung the bell. Fritz hadn't announced him. Yet here he was, occupying the chair reserved strictly for paying clients and people Wolfe intends to mentally dissect. He was a small, tightly wound man, perhaps in his late 50s, dressed in a tweed suit that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old paper. He had a leather briefcase resting on his knees, and his hands were folded perfectly still over the clasp. "Don't shoot," the man said, his voice dry and devoid of panic. The front door was ajar, a delivery boy with groceries, I believe. He left it open with a doorstop while carrying boxes to the basement stairs. I merely stepped inside. "You merely trespassed," I corrected, stepping fully into the room and leaving the door open behind me. "In this house, that's a capital offense. I'm Archie Goodwin. You are exactly 1 minute away from being tossed out onto West 35th Street. My name is Elias Trent," he replied, unblinking. "I am an antiquarian, and I am willing to pay Mr. Wolfe $50,000 to tell me who moved a book on my desk." I stared at him. I had dealt with murderers, blackmailers, and foreign spies, but men who broke into the brownstone to complain about interior decorating were a new breed. Before I could explain to Mr. Trent exactly how the sidewalk would feel against his tweed suit, the low, unmistakable hum of the elevator sounded in the hall. The doors opened. The heavy, deliberate footsteps approached. Nero Wolfe stopped in the doorway. He was wearing his usual yellow silk shirt and a dark brown tie. He took in the room instant lime standing near the center, tense the stranger in the red leather chair. Wolfe's jaw tightened. He did not yell. He did not demand an explanation. He simply turned his massive head a fraction of an inch toward me. "Archie, why is there a man in my office?" "He slipped in while Fritz was receiving the morning delivery," I said smoothly. "His name is Elias Trent. He claims he wants to pay you $50,000 because someone touched a book." Wolfe closed his eyes, inhaling deeply through his nose, expanding a chest that required a lot of expanding. I waited for the explosion. I waited for him to instruct me to physically remove the interloper so he could sit in peace and ring for beer. Instead, Wolfe opened his eyes, walked methodically to his desk, and lowered his vast bulk into his custom-made chair. He adjusted himself, moved a paperweight 1 inch to the right, and fixed his eyes on Trent. "You bypassed the security of my home," Wolfe murmured, his voice soft, which is always dangerous. "You invaded my privacy. You have annoyed Mr. Goodwin, which means he will be irritable all afternoon, and your premise is absurd. I am no security guard, Mr. I do not investigate misplaced reading material." "Good day. It was not merely a book," Trent said, leaning forward slightly. "It was a first folio edition of Montaigne's essays. And it was not misplaced. It was deliberately shifted precisely 2 inches to the left. The person who did it left a slip of paper inside. A forgery of a 16th century provenance document, inserted to make it appear as though my genuine copy is a fake." Wolfe's eyes, which had been half closed in dismissal, suddenly opened a millimeter. Montaigne. Wolfe considered the French philosopher one of the few men in history worth quoting. I could see the gears turning behind his broad forehead. The money was irrelevanty bank account was currently fat enough to keep Fritz buying truffles for months. but an assault on a rare Montaigne folio through meticulous intellectual sabotage. That was bait. "You are an antiquarian," Wolfe said flatly. "I run Trent Archival. 2 days ago I began negotiating the sale of the Montaigne to a private buyer. Yesterday morning I found the book shifted. The forged document inside is flawless. Ink, vellum, Frassingle, perfect. If the buyer's appraisers see it, my reputation is destroyed. My entire inventory will be suspect. Someone is trying to ruin me, Mr. Wolfe, without breaking a window or stealing a single item. Wolfe pressed his lips in and out. He reached out and pushed the button on his desk. Archie, notebook. I raised an eyebrow but walked over to my desk and pulled out my notebook and pen. "Mr. Trent," Wolfe said, leaning back and closing his eyes entirely. "You are an intruder, and your methods of seeking counsel are atrocious. However, your enemy possesses a theatricality that offends me and a taste in literature that demands respect. You will give Mr. Goodwin the names of everyone who has access to your office. Do not leave out the cleaning staff. Thank you, Mr. Wolfe," Trent breathed, looking visibly relieved. "Do not thank me," Wolfe snapped, his eyes still closed. "I am already regretting this. Archie, when he is finished, shows him the door, the front door, and ensure it is locked." Fritz entered with a tray holding 2 bottles of beer and a glass. Wolfe opened his eyes just long enough to pour, watching the foam rise to the absolute perfect height. The brownstone had been breached, the piece was shattered, and Wolfe had just taken a case about a book that moved 2 inches. I flipped my notebook open. It was going to be a long week. Elias Trent sat perched on the edge of the red leather chair like a frightened wren, rattling off names while I took them down in my notebook. Nero Wolfe had his eyes closed, his breathing slow and rhythmic, actively pretending the man in his office did not exist. I kept my shorthand neat. Trent's list was short, which meant my legwork might actually leave me time for a baseball game later in the week, provided Wolfe didn't decide to complicate things. There was his junior partner, Arthur Pendleton, who handled modern acquisitions. Silas Croft, an independent appraiser who rented desk space in Trent's suite. Nora Hastings, Trent's fiercely organized assistant who held the keys to the kingdom and the filing cabinets. And finally, Marcus Thorne, a rival collector. "That is 4, I said, flipping the page. "Plus the cleaning staff. Are you certain no one else has a key?" "Only those 3, besides myself," Trent insisted, clutching his briefcase. "Thorne doesn't have a key, but the outer office door is unlocked during business hours. Anyone could slip into my private study if Nora stepped away." Wolfe's eyes remained shut. "Archie, get him out." I stood up, ready to politely but firmly escort our trespassing client to the front door when the doorbell rang. I glanced at Wolfe. He opened one eye, glaring at me as if I had personally wired the bell to annoy him. I walked out to the hallway, peering through the one-way glass panel in the front door. Standing on the stoop were 2 people who looked entirely out of place on West 35th Street. One was a tall, sharply dressed woman in her early 30s, her face a mask of cold efficiency. The other was a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache and an aggressive scowl, wearing a coat that cost more than my car. I opened the door precisely 3 inches. "We are selling subscriptions to magazines, but we only take gold bullion. Try next door. I am looking for Elias Trent," the woman said, her voice clipped and authoritative. "My name is Nora Hastings. This is Arthur Pendleton. We know he came here." I sighed. The sanctity of the brownstone was officially besieged. "Wait here," I told them, shutting the door in their faces. I returned to the office. Wolfe had poured his second glass of beer and was eyeing the foam with deep concentration. Trent looked up, pale and anxious. "Your staff is on the stoop," I announced, leaning against my desk. "Nora Hastings and Arthur Pendleton. They seem eager to collect you." Trent stood up abruptly, dropping his briefcase. "They shouldn't be here. I didn't tell them I was coming to Nero Wolfe." Wolfe sighed, a heavy, resonant sound that vibrated through the room. He hated commotion, he despised uninvited guests, and he absolutely loathed feeling crowded in his own sanctuary. But he also hated unsolved puzzles, especially those involving Montaigne. "Archie," Wolfe rumbled, setting down his glass. "Bring them in." I raised an eyebrow. "Both of them? Into the office? Do not make me repeat myself." I went back to the front door and let the invaders inside. Hastings marched in as if she owned the place, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood. Pendleton followed, his scowl deepening as he took in the opulent surroundings of the house. I guided them into the office, standing near the door to block any sudden retreats. Hastings stopped in the center of the room, her eyes locking onto Trent. "Elias, what are you doing? You missed the morning meeting with the auction house. You are panicking over nothing." Pendleton sneered, crossing his arms. "He is wasting money on a private detective because he mislaid a piece of paper. It is embarrassing, Elias. You are making us look foolish." Wolfe did not stand. He did not offer them chairs. He sat behind his desk, massive and immovable, letting the silence stretch until the sheer weight of it forced them to look at him. He examined Nora Hastings, noting the tight grip on her handbag and the slight tremor in her seemingly confident posture. He shifted his gaze to Pendleton, assessing the aggressive stance that felt rehearsed. "You have intruded upon my home," Wolfe said smoothly. "We are trying to protect the business." Pendleton fired back, taking a half-step backward under Wolfe's heavy stare. "You are trying to control a narrative," Wolfe corrected. "You claim Mr. Trent is panicking over nothing, yet you tracked him here with desperate haste. Why did you do that?" The room went dead silent. Trent simply stared at his two trusted employees, betrayal dawning in his tired eyes. The trap was laid. Nora Hastings' jaw tightened, the muscles working under her pale skin, but she kept her mouth shut. Arthur Pendleton, however, lacked her discipline. He let out a sharp, derisive laugh that bounced off the thousands of books lining Wolfe's office walls. "Narrative?" Pendleton scoffed, stepping forward. "We are businessmen, Mr. Wolfe, not characters in a dime novel. Elias is an old man who misplaces things constantly. His eyesight is failing. He left a piece of scrap paper in a book and forgot about it, and now he is willing to squander company funds on a delusion." Wolfe's eyes were open now, fixed on Pendleton with the cold, unblinking intensity of a toad contemplating a particularly loud fly. He leaned back in his custom-built chair and laced his fingers over his center of gravity. "A delusion," Wolfe repeated softly. "A piece of scrap paper. Tell me, Mr. Pendleton, if it is merely scrap paper, why did you abandon your duties on a Tuesday morning to sprint across Manhattan in pursuit of a delusional old man? If his actions are harmlessly senile, let him waste his personal funds. Yet you are here, sweating, breathing heavily. You are afraid." "I am not afraid," Pendleton snapped, his face flushing a dull red. "I am protecting the firm." "You are protecting a commission," Nora Hastings interrupted, her voice cutting through the room like a cold chisel. She didn't look at Pendleton. Her eyes remained locked on Trent, who was still clutching his briefcase in the red leather chair. "Tell the truth, Arthur, or I will." Wolfe shifted his gaze to Hastings. "Miss Hastings, you have a pragmatic soul. Proceed." She adjusted the strap of her handbag, her posture rigid. "Arthur has negotiated the purchase of a collection of mid-century abstract expressionist letters. It requires liquid capital. The sale of the Montaigne folio to the private buyer was supposed to fund it. If the Montaigne is delayed, or if its provenance is publicly questioned, Arthur loses the abstract collection, and the rival buyer snatches it. He is desperate for the Montaigne sale to close by Friday." Pendleton glared at her. "We need to modernize, Nora. Elias is stuck in the 16th century. The firm cannot survive on dusty folios alone. We need turnover." He turned back to Wolfe. "I didn't touch his precious Montaigne. I don't even know how to forge 16th century vellum. The entire idea is absurd. Yet you benefit from its rapid, unquestioned sale. I pointed out from my spot by the door. Or maybe you benefit from Trent taking a fall, leaving you in charge of modernizing the firm. Keep out of this, underling." Pendleton sneered at me. I smiled. I love it when they call me names. It means I've hit a nerve. The name is Goodwin. And I'm the underling who will be asking your friends where you were yesterday morning. Wolfe tapped his index finger against his thumb, a sign of mild impatience. "Miss Hastings, you have keys to Mr. Trent's inner office. You manage his schedule. Did you shift the book?" "No," she said evenly. "I have worked for Elias for 8 years. I have no motive to sabotage him. My career is tied to his reputation." "What about Silas Croft?" Wolfe asked, his tone shifting to a rapid, clipped interrogation. "The appraiser who rents desk space. Does he have access?" Silas is a ghost, Trent said, his voice barely above a whisper. He comes and goes, but he hates Marcus Thorne. Thorne publicly humiliated Silas at an auction 3 years ago, claiming Silas had authenticated a forgery. And Thorne, Wolfe murmured, his eyes half closing again. The rival collector. Does he want Montaigne? Thorne wants everything, Hastings said bitterly. But mostly, he wants Elias ruined. He has been trying to buy us for a decade. A scandal regarding a forged Montaigne document would drop our valuation to 0. He could swallow the firm for pennies. Wolfe absorbed this, his massive frame perfectly still. The room felt heavy, thick with unspoken resentments and clashing ambitions. We had an ambitious junior partner needing quick cash, an icy assistant holding the keys, a disgraced appraiser harboring grudges, and a ruthless rival circling the waters. It was a neat little knot of human flaws. Wolfe pressed his lips together, pushing them out and pulling them in. Finally, he unlaced his fingers and placed his palms flat on the desk. "Mr. Trent," Wolfe said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge passing a sentence. "You will return to your office. You will conduct your business as if nothing has happened. You will not discuss the Montaigne, the forgery, or my employment with anyone. Mr. Pendleton, Miss Hastings, you will escort him back. If either of you attempts to interfere with my investigation, I will see to it that you are publicly humiliated." "You have no authority," Pendleton blustered, though he was already backing toward the door. "I have Archie," Wolfe said simply. "Good day." I opened the front door and watched the three of them march down the stoop, a miserable parade of suspicion. When I returned to the office, Wolfe was already pouring his third beer. "Archie," he said between sips, "you have names, you have streets, go poke them." The sky over Manhattan remained a sharp, unblinking blue as I left the brownstone heading downtown to poke at Elias Trent's knot of anxious employees and bitter rivals. Wolfe was safely anchored behind his desk, presumably contemplating the structural integrity of 16th century vellum, while Fritz debated the merits of time versus tarragon. My job was less philosophical. I had to know who was lying. Trent Archival occupied the 4th floor of a respectable but aging building on Madison Avenue. The outer office smelled of lemon polish and expensive dust. Nora Hastings was at her desk, typing with the rigid precision of a metronome. She barely glanced up when I walked in, her posture broadcasting a clear desire for me to turn around and leave. "Good afternoon, Miss Hastings," I said, leaning on the edge of her mahogany desk. "I am doing a survey on workplace morale. How many daggers are currently pointed at your boss back?" "Mr. Trent is in his private study," she replied flatly, ignoring my charm. He asked not to be disturbed. "Arthur is out at a gallery, presumably trying to salvage his modern art deal. And if you are looking for Silas Croft, he is in the appraisal room down the hall. I suggest you bother him." I gave her my best grin. "You are a fountain of cooperation. Tell me, Nora, when you lock up the office, who checks the private study?" "I do," she said, her eyes finally meeting mine. "Every night. And the Montaigne was exactly where it belonged yesterday evening when I left at 6. The inner door was locked. The outer door was locked. Only Elias and I have the keys. Then it's a locked room mystery," I mused. "Unless someone has very nimble fingers or a very good copy of your key." She stopped typing. "I don't lose my keys, Mr. Goodwin, and I don't forge documents. I want this firm to survive." I left her to her typewriter and wandered down the hall to the appraisal room. It was a windowless space crammed with magnifying lamps, chemical solvents, and stacks of yellowed manuscripts. Silas Croft sat hunched over a work table, a jeweler's loop screwed into his right eye. He was a frail man with thinning grey hair and a perpetual tremor in his hands, which seemed like a severe occupational hazard for an authenticator. "Mr. Croft," I announced myself. "Archie Goodwin. Nero Wolfe sent it to me." Croft jumped, nearly knocking over a bottle of ethanol. He pulled the loop from his eye and squinted at me. He looked like a man who had spent too much time living in the footnotes of other people's books. "Wolfe?" Croft muttered, his voice raspy. "Elias actually hired him? Over a displaced book?" "Over a forged provenance slip," I corrected, pulling up a stool. "A very good one. The kind someone with a deep understanding of historical papers might create if they held a grudge against their employer." Croft's pale face flushed. "I didn't do it." Why would I sabotage Elias? He is the only one who gave me a desk after Marcus Thorne destroyed my reputation. Maybe you wanted to get back in the game, I suggested mildly. Maybe Thorne paid you to plant it so he could buy the firm at a discount. You get a nice payday, and Thorne gets his revenge on Trent. Thorne wouldn't pay me a dime, Croft spat, his hands shaking worse now. He hates me. He ruined me just to prove he was the smartest man in the room. If anyone planted that forgery, it was Arthur Pendleton. The boy is desperate. He owes money to people who don't send polite collection letters. That was an interesting wrinkle. Debt changes the geometry of any room. I thanked Silas for his candor and left the building. My next stop was Marcus Thorne's gallery, a sleek, modern space in Chelsea that looked like a very expensive hospital. Thorne was holding court near a massive, incomprehensible sculpture, sipping espresso. He was slick, polished, and radiated the kind of arrogant confidence that makes my right hook itch. I didn't introduce myself. I just browsed, getting close enough to hear him bragging to a client about a major acquisition he planned to finalize by Friday. The same day Arthur Pendleton's abstract collection deal was supposed to close. The timing was entirely too neat. I headed back to the brownstone. The pieces were all there, scattered on the pavement: debt, revenge, ambition, and a locked door. Wolfe was going to have to do some heavy lifting to fit them together, but at least I had gathered the heavy stones. The early evening sky over Manhattan remained stubbornly clear, casting long shadows across West 35th Street as I climbed the steps. I used my key, hung my hat, and entered the hallway. The house was quiet, filled with the aroma of roasted duck drifting from Fritz's domain. It was 6:15. Wolfe would be down from the plant rooms, seated behind his desk, waiting for his pre-dinner beer and my report. I entered the office and stopped cold. Wolfe was in his custom-made chair. He had a glass of beer, perfectly poured, but he wasn't drinking it. He was staring straight ahead at the center of his desk, his massive frame immobilized, his lips pushing out and pulling in with terrifying intensity. I moved to my desk, keeping my voice neutral. I had lived with him long enough to know when the room was dangerously charged. I have returned from the pavement, I announced. Arthur Pendleton is allegedly in debt to bad people, making his need for a quick commission motivational. Silas Croft is shaking like a leaf and blames Pendleton. Marcus Thorne is currently bragging about a major acquisition he expects to close Friday. Nora Hastings is still a block of ice. Wolfe did not acknowledge my detective work. He simply raised his index finger and pointed at his desk. Archie, look at the atlas. I frowned and stepped closer. Wolfe keeps a massive world atlas on the left side of his blotter. It is a fixture. It never moves unless he is actively consulting it to win an argument about obscure European borders. The atlas had been shifted precisely 2 inches to the left. The hairs on my neck stood up. It was not like that when I left, I said, my voice dropping, and Fritz knows better than to dust your desk while you are home. Fritz did not touch it, Wolfe murmured softly. I discovered it when I came down at 6 o'clock. The door was locked. No one has entered since you left. Then it happened earlier, I concluded, mentally replaying the morning's chaotic invasion. When Hastings and Pendleton barged in. When Trent was sitting in the red chair, but I was in the room the whole time. You were by the door, Wolfe corrected gently, focusing your attention on Miss Hastings and Mr. Pendleton, managing the crowd. For perhaps 10 seconds your eyes were on the hallway when you let them in, and again when you escorted them out. That was the window. I leaned over the desk. Someone reached over and pushed it, a deliberate mocking gesture. They replicated the crime right in front of us. Open it, Wolfe commanded. I draped a clean handkerchief over my fingers and carefully flipped the heavy cover open. Resting precisely in the center of the Atlantic Ocean, on the map of shipping routes, was a single small slip of paper. It was thick, slightly yellowed material with uneven edges. Vellum, I breathed. 16th century by the look of it. Blank. A calling card, Wolfe said. The sheer, freezing rage in his expression would have terrified a lesser man. Nero Wolfe tolerates many sins in humanity, but he does not tolerate someone making a fool of him in his own office. The sanctuary had been desecrated. They are mocking you, I said. Telling you they can forge the Montaigne document, shift a book in Trent's locked office, and do the exact same thing right under your nose. The culprit isn't just greedy, they are arrogant. Wolfe took a slow, deliberate sip of his beer. He set the glass with a soft click. He merely settled deeper into his chair, a mountain of flesh and intellect preparing for war. Arrogance is a flaw, Archie, Wolfe said quietly. It leads to unnecessary risks. This person believes they are orchestrating a masterpiece of psychological pressure. They want Elias Trent to crumble, and they want me to know I am powerless to stop it. What are your instructions? I asked, flipping to a fresh page. Wolfe closed his eyes. Lock the doors, Archie, and call Saul Panzer. We are no longer merely investigating a forgery. We are exterminating a nuisance. I walked to my desk phone. The puzzle had just become intensely personal. I began to dial the number. I picked up the phone and dialed the number that I knew by heart, the one that led to a small, nondescript apartment where the best freelance operative in the business kept his hat. Saul Panzer doesn't look like much as a small, wiry man with a big nose and a penchant for wearing clothes that make him invisible in a crowd, but he has a memory like a steel trap and the persistence of a glacier. When the phone picked up on the third ring, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I told him the situation, the names on my list, and the fact that someone had just had the audacity to rearrange the furniture on Nero Wolfe's own desk. I could practically hear Saul's eyebrows go up through the receiver. He promised to be at the brownstone within the hour, ready for instructions. Wolfe remained in his chair, a silent mountain of indignation. He hadn't touched his beer since the discovery of the shifted atlas. To anyone else it was just a book moved 2 inches, but to Wolfe it was an act of war. It was a breach of the one place on earth where he felt absolute control. I sat at my desk and watched him, waiting for the internal machinery to finish grinding. When the doorbell finally rang, I didn't even check the mirror. I knew it was Saul. I let him in, and he stepped into the office with that quiet, cautious grace of his, nodding to me and standing respectfully before Wolfe's desk. Saul, Wolfe rumbled, his voice low and dangerous. Mr. Goodwin has briefed you on the trespass. We are dealing with a person who possesses a high degree of technical skill in forgery and an even higher degree of psychological vanity. They believe they can dance between the raindrops. I've got the name, Mr. Wolfe, Saul said, his voice steady. Where do you want me to start? Focus on the movement of vellum, Wolfe commanded. 16th century paper is not something one buys at a corner stationer. It requires a specific provenance of its own. Check out specialty dealers, restoration labs, and private auctions. Someone acquired a blank sheet of aged vellum recently, or they stole it from a collection. I want to know who has been asking after the chemical composition of Tudor-era inks. Saul nodded, already mentally mapping out the dusty corners of the city where such things were traded. And the debt, sir, Archie mentioned Arthur Pendleton might be underwater. Investigate the debt, certainly, Wolfe said, but do not be blinded. Debt is a common motif, making it a convenient shroud for a more complex malice. I am more interested in the movements of Silas Croft and Nora Hastings during the hour Mr. Trent was here this morning. One of them, or perhaps an emissary of Mr. Thorne, managed to enter this house. I want to know how they coordinated the timing. I watched Saul take it all. He didn't need a notebook, he just absorbed the instructions like a sponge. Wolfe then turned his attention back to me. Archie, you will return to the Madison Avenue office tomorrow. You will not look for forged papers. You will look for the tools of the forgery. A man who creates a perfect 16th century document does not do so with a fountain pen and a bottle of quink. He needs a laboratory, however small. He needs light, precision, and solitude. You think they did it on site? I asked. It is the only place where the proximity to the original Montaigne would allow for such a precise replication of the physical characteristics, Wolfe explained. The culprit is someone who spends a great deal of time in those rooms, someone who can lock a door and not be questioned. Go there, be obnoxious, be observant, force them to react to your presence. Saul slipped out as quietly as he had arrived, a shadow merging back into the New York night. I looked at Wolfe, who finally reached for his glass. The foam had settled, but he didn't seem to mind. He took a long swallow, his eyes fixed on the blank slip of vellum I had placed on a tray. The gears were locked into place now. We were no longer just defending a client's reputation, we were hunting someone who had dared to disturb the peace of the brownstone. Fritz announced dinner, but for once, I think Wolfe was more interested in the hunt than the duck. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 9, and the resonance seemed to settle into the very floorboards of the office. Nero Wolfe was in a rare state knot of agitation which would involve pacing and shouting, but of a terrifying, stony stillness. He had finished his dinner of roasted duck with a silent efficiency that signaled his mind was already miles ahead of his appetite. I sat at my desk, cleaning my fingernails with a pocket knife and watching him. The blank slip of 16th century vellum was still resting on the brass tray, a mute witness to the intruder's arrogance. Wolfe's eyes were closed, but he wasn't napping. He was constructing a cage, bar by bar, and he needed me to provide the lock. "Archie," he said, his voice a low vibration that didn't require him to open his eyes. "The vanity of our opponent is their primary lever. They did not merely want to ruin Mr. Trent, they wanted to demonstrate a superiority of intellect. To do so, they must witness the effects of their work. They must see the confusion, fear, and ultimate surrender of their victim. They are not content with a silent victory." "So you're saying they're going to come back for an encore?" I asked, putting the knife away. Moving the atlas was a pretty loud opening act. "What's the finale?" "The finale is the sale of the Montaigne folio on Friday," Wolfe replied, finally opening his eyes to a slit. "If the forgery is discovered by the buyer's experts, the humiliation is public and permanent. If it is not discovered, the culprit has proven they can deceive the best minds in the field. Either way, they win. Unless, of course, the book is no longer the centerpiece of the drama." He leaned forward, his massive palms resting on the desk. "You will contact Mr. Treat. Tell him that I have discovered a second forgery, one far more sophisticated than the first, hidden within his own personal ledger. Tell him it is so perfect that only a chemical analysis of the ink can confirm it. Make sure you speak loudly enough for Miss Hastings to hear, or within earshot of Mr. Pendleton's open door. The information must permeate that office like a gas." I grinned. "You're baiting the hook with a bigger fish. If they think you've found something else, something that proves a pattern of long-term sabotage, they'll have to move to protect themselves. They'll want to know what that second forgery is." "Precisely," Wolfe murmured. "And to do so, they will have to commit further indiscretion. They will have to attempt to retrieve or alter the evidence they believe I possess. We are inviting them back to the scene of their most recent triumph. They found this house accessible once their ego will convince them it is accessible again." I spent the next 20 minutes on the phone, playing the part of the harried assistant to a brilliant but demanding detective. I spoke to Elias Trent, but I made sure my voice carried the right note of urgent discovery. I mentioned suspicious entries and inconsistent ink density. I could practically feel the tension on the other end of the line, and I knew that in the Madison Avenue office, the air had just turned very thin. By the time I hung up, the trap was set. Saul Panzer checked in at 11 o'clock. He had found what Wolfe had asked for. A specialty paper restorer in Brooklyn had sold 3 sheets of blank, aged vellum to a man answering Silas Croft's general description 2 weeks ago, but the man had paid in cash and wore a heavy scarf that obscured his face. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a warm one. Saul also confirmed that Arthur Pendleton had been seen entering a private gambling club 3 nights in a row, looking worse for wear each time he left. "Good," Wolfe said, a grim satisfaction appearing on his face. "Saul, you will occupy the front room tonight. Archie, you will stay in office. I shall retire to my room. If our guest is as predictable as their vanity suggests, they will not be able to resist the lure of my desk before the sun rises. They believe they are playing a game of chess with a man who will not move from his chair. They have forgotten that the chair is at the center of the web. I checked the cylinder of my Marley, made sure the front door bolt was thrown, and settled into the darkness of the office. The streetlights outside cast long, skeletal shadows across the Persian rug. It was a waiting game now, the kind that Wolfe usually left to me while he dreamed of orchids, but tonight, the atmosphere felt different. The brownstone wasn't just a house, it was a baited field, and we were waiting for the fox to realize the fence had been mended behind him. The clock in the hallway struck 11 on Friday morning. its heavy chime marking the arrival of our guests. Nero Wolfe was already seated, a mountain of yellow silk and grim determination, his fingers resting lightly on the arms of his chair. He had spent the morning with his orchids, but the calm of the greenhouse had not followed him downstairs. The air in the office was thick, not with the smell of Fritz cooking, but with the sharp, acidic scent of collective anxiety. I stood by the door, playing the part of the sentinel, watching as they filed in. Elias Trent, looking as though he hadn't slept since Monday Nora Hastings, as rigid and polished as a new bayonet Arthur Pendleton, twitching in his chair, and Silas Croft, whose hands were shaking so violently he had to tuck them under his thighs. "Be seated," Wolfe rumbled, though they already were. He let the silence stretch, a tactic he uses to let the suspect's own nerves do the heavy lifting. He looked at each of them in turn, his eyes skipping over Trent and settling briefly on the others. "We are here because a book was moved. To a layman, it is a trifle. To a man of Mr. Trent's profession, it is a catastrophe of reputation. To me, it was an intrusion into the privacy of my home. The person who shifted the Montaigne folio in Mr. Trent's study also shifted an atlas on my desk. It was a gesture of profound vanity." "We've been through this, Wolfe," Pendleton snapped, though his voice lacked its usual oily confidence. "You claimed there was a second forgery. You called Elias and threw the whole office into a panic. Where is it? Or was that just a cheap trick to justify your outrageous fee?" Wolfe didn't even blink. "The second forgery was indeed a provocation, Mr. Pendleton, a lure for a specific kind of ego. I found no second forgery in the ledgers because none was needed. The first was quite sufficient to reveal the architect. You see, the forgery of a 16th century provenance document requires more than just old vellum and the right ink. It requires a specific psychological profilione that finds joy not in the theft of an object, but in the invisible manipulation of its value. It requires someone who feels undervalued and seeks to prove their superiority over those who hold the keys." Silas Croft let out a ragged breath. "I told you I didn't do it. I have no reason to ruin Elias." "On the contrary, Mr. Croft," Wolfe said, his voice dropping an octave, "you have every reason to want to prove you are still the master of your craft, despite the shadows cast upon your name by Marcus Thorne. But you lack the cold, calculated patience for this particular game. You are a reaction man, not a long-term strategy. And Mr. Pendleton, while your debts are real and your desperation is palpable, you are far too blunt an instrument for such a delicate operation. You would have simply stolen the book and sold it to a fence. You wouldn't have stayed behind to play games with bookmarks." Nora Hastings sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the blank vellum slip that still sat on Wolfe's desk. "Then who, Mr. Wolfe? If we are all so inadequate, who managed to breach your sacred brownstone?" Wolfe leaned forward, the movement of his great bulk causing the chair to groan. The breach was a masterpiece of coordination. It required someone who knew exactly when the grocery deliveries arrived, someone who could slip away from their post without being missed, and someone who possessed the one thing every forger needs: access, not just to the books but to the firm's history. You, Miss Hastings, have been gatekeepers for 8 years. You saw Mr. Pendleton's incompetence and Mr. Trent's aging grip on the business. You realized that if the firm's reputation were dismantled, a buyer like Marcus Thorne would move in and he would need a new partner, one who actually knew where the bodies were buried. "That's preposterous," Nora said, her voice like ice. "I was here when Elias arrived on Tuesday. I never left the office." "You didn't have to," Wolfe replied. "You have a cousin, do you not? A young man with theatrical ambitions and a desperate need for cash, currently employed by the very delivery service that brings our groceries. He didn't just leave the door open, he handed you the slip of vellum he had retrieved from your desk that morning. And it was you, during the 10 seconds Mr. Pendleton's arrival, who reached across my desk and moved the atlas, distracted Goodwin. It was your signature, Miss Hastings, your one moment of unalloyed pride. The silence that followed was absolute. Nora Hastings didn't scream or deny it. She simply looked at Wolfe with a terrifying, hollow smile, the mask of the perfect assistant finally slipping to reveal the predator beneath. The silence in the office was no longer the heavy, expectant quiet of a mystery. It had become the cold, thin air of a high-altitude peak where only the predator and the prey remained. Nora Hastings did not flinch. She did not reach for a handkerchief or glance at the door. She simply sat, her spine a straight line of defiance, and looked at Nero Wolfe with a clinical curiosity that was far more chilling than a confession. Arthur Pendleton looked as though he were about to be sick, and Elias Trent was staring at his trusted assistant as if she had suddenly sprouted a second head. Wolfe, however, did not move. He was a mountain of yellow silk, immovable and unimpressed by the theatricality of her composure. "You speak of signatures, Mr. Wolfe," Nora said, her voice dropping its professional veneer to reveal a jagged edge of resentment. "But you have no proof. A cousin who delivers groceries? A piece of paper that could have come from any desk in Manhattan? You are guessing. You are spinning a tale, because you cannot stand the idea that a woman you dismissed as a mere clerk could outmaneuver you in your own sanctuary." Wolfe's lips pushed out and in. "I do not guess, Miss Hastings. I observe and I conclude. You speak of proof as if it were a physical weight, something to be measured on a scale. But the proof is in the pattern. You didn't just want to ruin Mr. Two wanted to replace him. You have been systematically undermining his confidence for months, whispering about his failing eyesight and his memory. The Montaigne forgery was merely the final stroke. If the sale collapsed, Marcus Thorne would have stepped in to buy the remains of Trent Archival, and he wouldn't have kept Mr. Pendleton, whose gambling debts make him a liability. He would have kept the woman who proved she could manage the inventory with such creative precision. "Still a story," she countered, her eyes flashing. "A story told by a man who stays in his room and sends his errand boy to do the lifting." I felt my jaw tighten at errand boy, but I didn't move. I was watching her hands. They were still folded in her lap, but the knuckles were white. Wolfe, sensing the shift in the room, leaned back, his vast bulk settling into the chair. "The physical proof, Miss Hastings, is not in the vellum or the atlas," Wolfe said softly. "It is in the ink. You mentioned the tampering was flawless. It was. But to create 16th century ink that passes a modern chemical test, one must use a specific ratio of iron gall and oak apples. It is a messy process. It leaves traces, not on paper but in person. Silas Croft's hands are stained with decades of such work, which is why he was your perfect scapegoat. But you, Miss Hastings, are meticulous. You wore gloves, you cleaned your station, but you forgot one thing, the scent." Wolfe gestured toward the brass tray. "Iron gall ink has a very specific metallic odor when it is fresh. When you reached across my desk on Tuesday to move that atlas, you left more than a slip of paper. You left a faint, lingering trace of that acidity on the wood. I smelled it the moment I sat down. And this morning, when you walked into this room, the scent was still there, clinging to the wool of your sleeve. You prepared a second document last night, didn't you? The one you intended to plant in the ledger to satisfy my discovery." Nora's composure finally fractured. Her eyes darted to her left sleeve, a reflexive movement that was as good as a signed confession in front of a grand jury. She realized it the second she did it, her face turning a muddy grey. "Elias is a relic," she spat, the words tumbling out with a bitterness that had been fermenting for years. "He sits on a fortune in history and treats it like a hobby. I did the work. I kept the books. I managed the clients. Why shouldn't I be the one to profit when the house falls?" He wouldn't even have noticed the book was moved if he hadn't been looking for an excuse to doubt himself. "He noticed because he loves the work, Miss Hastings," Wolfe said, his voice devoid of pity. "You merely covet the proceeds. There is a vast difference. Archie, the telephone. Call Inspector Cramer. Tell him we have a trespasser who has graduated to conspiracy and attempted fraud, and tell him to bring a chemist. I believe Miss Hastings' coat will be of great interest to the laboratory." Elias Trent looked at her, his eyes full of a profound, weary sadness. 8 years, Nora. I would have given you the firm eventually. Eventually isn't soon enough, she whispered, her voice dead. I walked to the desk and picked up the receiver. The game was over. The brownstone had been defended, the intruder unmasked, and the intellectual hierarchy restored. Wolfe reached for his beer, his eyes already drifting toward the window, where the afternoon sun was hitting the glass. He had one, but he looked bored. The puzzle was solved, and now there was only the paperwork and the policed parts of the job he liked the least. The departure of Inspector Cramer and his entourage had left the brownstone feeling slightly hollowed out, as if the air itself had been scrubbed of a lingering, oily residue. Nora Hastings had been led away with a cold, silent dignity that suggested she was already calculating her legal defence, while Arthur Pendleton had practically bolted for the door, likely to find a drink or a lender who wouldn't break his kneecaps. Silas Croft had lingered just long enough to thank Wolfe, with a tearful, shaky gratitude that Wolfe found utterly intolerable. Finally, the heavy front door had clicked shut for the last time that afternoon, and the house returned to its natural state of quiet, disciplined order. I stood by the window, watching the tail lights of the police cruiser disappear toward 9th Avenue. "Well," I said, turning back to the room, "that was a lot of mileage for a book that moved 2 inches. I hope Trent's check clears before he realizes he's lost his most efficient employee. Although, considering she was trying to bury him alive, maybe efficient isn't the right word." Wolfe did not answer immediately. He was leaning back in his chair, his eyes closed, his hands resting on the topographical map of his middle. He looked less like a victorious detective and more like a man who had just survived a particularly tedious lecture on a subject he already understood. He didn't open his eyes until Fritz appeared in the doorway, silent as a shadow, to announce that dinner would be served in precisely 20 minutes. "Duck bigarred, Archie," Wolfe murmured, the name of the dish acting like a restorative tonic. "Fritz has spent 4 hours on the sauce. It would be a sacrilege to approach it with a mind cluttered by the sordid details of Miss Hastings' ambition. Try to keep my mind pure," I promised, moving to my desk to straighten the stacks of paper. "But you have to admit, she had guts. Stepping into this office and moving your atlas right under our noses, that's like tweaking a lion's whiskers while he's yawning. She almost deserved to get away with it." "Deserve has nothing to do with it," Wolfe snapped, his eyes open. "She suffered from the most common and fatal of human delusions, the belief that technical proficiency is a substitute for character. She could forge the 16th century, but she couldn't inhabit it. She lacked the patience of the scholars she sought to emulate. She wanted the prize without the discipline of the pursuit." I sat on the edge of my desk, swinging a leg. "And the atlas? Was that just a mistake? Or was she really trying to tell you that you're getting slow?" Wolfe grunted, a sound of deep, tectonic dissatisfaction. "It was a provocation, Archie, a classic tactical error. She could not resist the urge to see if I was truly the captive of my own routines. She viewed my immobility as a weakness, a physical limitation that extended to the mind. She thought that because I do not chase suspects down dark alleys, I do not see the shadow they leave behind. Her vanity demanded a witness to her cleverness, and in choosing me, she ensured her own destruction." "Well, the web is back in order," I said, checking my watch. "The atlas is in its proper place, the vellum is in a police evidence bag, and the front door is double-bolted. Peace has been restored to the sanctuary." Wolfe stood up, a process that always reminds me of a ship being launched from a dry dock. He smoothed the front of his yellow silk shirt and adjusted his tie with a precision that would have made a diamond cutter weep. He began the long, deliberate walk toward the dining room, his pace measured and unhurried. At the door he paused and looked back at the office. The late afternoon sun was hitting the bookshelves, highlighting the gold leaf on the spines of 1,000 volumes. "It is a curious thing, Archie," he said, his voice reflecting a rare moment of philosophical indulgence. "People often complain that the world is chaotic and unpredictable. They are wrong. The world is remarkably consistent. Introducing variables is just human stupidity. Miss Hastings thought she could rewrite the history of a book, but she forgot that she was merely a footnote in the history of her own greed." "Deep," I said, following him toward the duck's scent. "Very deep. Personally, I am just glad I don't have to spend tomorrow morning smelling iron gall ink and talking to people who use words like provenance every third sentence." Wolfe didn't look back. "Indeed, and Archie, if the grocery delivery boy arrives tomorrow, you will personally inspect the crates. I have no desire to have my evening meal disrupted by any further theatrical cousins." "You got it, boss," I said, reaching for the light switch. "From now on, the only things entering this house will be invited, paid for, or edible, especially edible." The office went dark, the shadows of West 35th Street lengthening over the desk where a book had once moved 2 inches and changed the course of 4 lives. Down the hall, The silver clinked against the china, and the master of the house settled in for the only thing he considered more important than justice, his dinner.